You're in the water loop.
Waterloop is made possible in part by grants from Spring Point Partners and the Walton Family Foundation. The Waterloop podcast is sponsored by Flume. It's the perfect device for tracking your home's water use in real time on your smartphone. It's so easy to use. You just attach a small device to your water meter using a band, the same way you put a watch on your wrist. Then you connect to Wi-Fi, you download the app, and you're up and running. It's as simple as that. You don't need a plumber. You don't need to cut into any of your pipes or water lines. Very easy to set up. Then you can set water budgets, how much you want to use each day or week. It'll keep track of that. It'll tell you what's going on in your house with water use minute by minute. It'll send alerts to you if there's excessive water use or if it suspects a leak. In fact, when I installed Flume at my house, it told me almost right away about a leak. I was losing a gallon of water every 6 minutes. I'm honestly not sure when I would have found that without Flume. You can use promo code WATERLOOP for 10% off at flumewater.com. Waterloop. Hey everyone, this is Travis with Waterloop. I want to talk to you for just a minute about High Sierra shower heads. I use them in my house because they're a water-efficient fixture, but I'm a big fan for other reasons as well, including their design and construction. They're made of solid metal. So this High Sierra shower head I have in my hand right now, you can tell that it's a quality, well-made product, unlike the vast majority of shower heads, which involve a lot of plastic in their construction. And that's something we need less of, right? Less consumer products with plastic in them. The other awesome thing is their nozzle design. It's a unique patented nozzle that's not going to clog like so many other shower heads. The other thing about this nozzle is that it will work in low pressure. You'll still get a strong, powerful, but water-efficient shower. Use promo code LOOP20 for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com.
You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis. Going to be talking about the Mississippi River and specifically Arkansas for this episode. Very happy to be joined by Jason Milks. He is Delta Projects Manager with the Nature Conservancy of Arkansas. Jason, thanks for jumping on.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks, Travis.
Yeah, so we got to chat a bit before this podcast. I'm really interested to talk about all things Arkansas and water and Mississippi here. Could you talk a little bit first about the relationship between the Mississippi River and Arkansas? You know, what does the Mississippi River mean to Arkansas, and what does Arkansas mean to the Mississippi River?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Mississippi River is the eastern border of the state of Arkansas, and we share that border with Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee. It is also the lifeblood of the agricultural region of Arkansas. So we have agriculture across the state, but row crop agriculture in particular is concentrated in the eastern third of Arkansas, which is geologically the Mississippi alluvial valley. So it's a heavily industrial row crop area of Arkansas. It's the row crop agriculture is the number one economy in Arkansas. And so that to be nestled in the historical geologic floodplain of the Mississippi River is not a small thing. It's also a very culturally distinct region. It's the Delta, as we call it, shares that same geography with Mississippi and Louisiana. It's in addition to just farming, it's also blues, it's tamales, it's ducks. It's a whole cultural, culturally distinct region of the country.
I haven't really personally spent really time in that area there. I've spent time down in New Orleans and kind of that southern Louisiana, but I'm really interested to get out there and travel around a little bit. So hopefully post kind of pandemic here, I can do that. You can show me some of these spots. I've seen so much on social media and the news about just water in Arkansas, and it seems like there's a lot of fun to be had and a lot of beauty throughout Arkansas. When it comes to water and that Mississippi area. One of the things that jumped out at me is if you look at Google Earth or the satellite version on Google Maps, you see just like this big, huge, unforested swath running down the whole, that whole eastern corridor of Arkansas and even really starting up, I think, maybe at St. Louis and running down. What is that there?
Yeah, well, you've described what is the Mississippi, what we call the lower Mississippi alluvial valley. So essentially from Cairo, Illinois, south to the confluence of the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya is really what we're referring to is this Delta region. But even further down to the coast of Louisiana, you would consider it to be, the lower Mississippi alluvial valley. This is it's a geological area that's been created from originally the Ohio River flowed through this part of the world, and now the Mississippi. It's terraced over millions of years. So you've got the active floodplain is much less than what you see across there, but it's approximately 24 million acres in size across the three states. I think Arkansas has approximately 8 million of that. And historically, it would have been large bottomland hardwood forests, a lot of swamps, a lot of cypress, lined rivers and low-lying areas. It floods frequently, even today. And that's part of the reason why it's such an important agricultural region is the soil was highly laden with, overland flooding sediments made for extremely rich soil. And it was began significant development in the late 19th century. And by the mid 20th century, you had several million acres of row crop, particularly cotton, and then rice and soybeans were introduced mid 20th century. And now Arkansas produces half of the rice in the United States alone. So it's a couple million acres of rice farming, a couple million acres of soybean farming, 500 to 600,000 acres of cotton farming, all sort of embedded in this old floodplain that still has a lot of wetland in it.
So what does it mean for the river and the other, waterways in that area to have this, 24 million acres, I think you said, of agriculture going on?
Well, I mean, honestly, the agriculture is the economic engine for that region. I mean, it's a historically, economically depressed region outside of agriculture. That's what the communities and the people living in that region rely upon. So I don't want to minimize that. But, obviously the development of that industry has some environmental trade-offs. And there's been a lot of alteration, a lot of land clearing, obviously, if you have 24 million acres of forest. And now there's probably collectively 1 million, 2 million, somewhere across those three states of forest remaining. So that's a whole lot of impact. The rivers are the smaller rivers have largely been channelized to expedite drainage. And that comes with nutrient runoff. It comes with sediment in the rivers. It has, say it's sort of accentuated some of the flooding in some regions because you've got a floodplain that's now developed into farmland and in some cases communities. And so those are hit harder by flooding than they would have been if they were just forest. So there's, it's an important economic engine for sure, but it's increasingly apparent that we're having to live with some of the environmental consequences of that development.
Yeah, so I totally get that agriculture is so important. We have to eat. We've got to feed our country. These people depend on farms for their lives and livelihoods. I'm a big fan of farms. Love them. Grew up across from one. What are some of the efforts to try to deal with the impacts on the river from agriculture? The sediment, the nutrients. How do you and others there try to, keep these people going with their lives and livelihoods, but also try to reduce the impacts on the Mississippi?
That's a great question. Yeah, it's I would say that the conservation movement has really evolved over time, where I think early on we were interested in protecting what forests and wetlands remained throughout the sort of economic development of agriculture. Now we are proactively engaged with agriculture producers to help identify efficiencies in water use, particularly groundwater use that's crucial to agriculture production in this region. But we overuse the aquifer's ability to recharge. So we find win-win solutions with agriculture producers. If we can, the Nature Conservancy can partner with a farmer and put a timer on a well that saves water and at the same time saves money for the producer, then we see that as a win-win. So we set up projects, lots of stakeholders, federal governments, state governments, farmers, even supply chain companies, set up projects that identify where common ground can be made, and realize that for this region to remain a productive economic engine, we're going to have to adapt to some of the challenges that the environmental degradation presents. So if you've got losing groundwater, if you've got stream and nutrients so heavily sediment and nutrients so heavily in the stream that it has a negative effect on flooding and biodiversity, then there's regulations involved that put limits on producers on what they can do. So we want to find environmental solutions that allow farmers to continue to be farmers, but recognizing that that we can find ways to do conservation at the same time, and often in a way that makes the sustainability of the farm better for the landowners.
What has been the trend or the reaction among the agriculture community to the environmental community and others trying to encourage some of these best practices and address some of these issues? I know that there's a lot of tension involved in that, right? Because they're just understandably really trying to get their farms doing what they need to. But what's the trend, I guess, or how are things going?
Yeah, that's a great question. Agriculture is hard work. It's a risky business in the best of times. When we are in an environment of increasing rain and flooding, this just makes it more challenging. Conservationists understand that. We recognize that those challenges have consequent environmental impacts as well. So we're interested in working together to find these solutions. But I think in my experience, most farmers consider themselves stewards of the land. Most of them are multi-generational. Their grandfathers or great grandfathers started, the farm in most cases, and they want their children, their families to be successful farming as well. But in order to do that, the land has to remain productive. They have to be good stewards of their land in order for that to occur. So they're interested in maintaining good water. They're interested in maintaining their topsoil. It's in the interest of their production. Where I think a lot of fear and trust, erodes comes from a heavy-handed top-down approach. Here's what you're going to do, sort of engagement with producers. And we found the Nature Conservancy and many of the partners that we work with on the ground, engaging, building trust, having common sense conversations with farmers and finding those solutions, letting them be a part of the solution, right? And understanding what their decision matrix, over a 12-month period on a farm really is. What are they concerned about? Understanding their perspective and identifying where conservation can be a useful tool is an important strategy for building trust and getting the benefits to both constituents. Regulations have a tendency to be not right sized. They can be overarching and have unintended consequences. I think we're trying to find those, really understand the decisions on the ground and make choices that are more informed by the people working on the land.
Yeah. I was wondering if you could share maybe a few more examples of success stories or positive approaches to conservation that have worked for both water and farms.
Yeah. One of the greatest success stories I can tell has to do with a federal program that the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service administers. It's called Wetland Reserve. It started back in the mid-90s. And it's an easement program where the USDA provides a financial incentive to a farmer to essentially retire a frequently flooded piece of ground in exchange for reforestation and wetland conservation on that property. The benefit to the farmer is if they've inherited land or purchased land that they didn't realize flooded so frequently that it's difficult to make a crop on, it's not serving them any productive value. And so this USDA program, it's competitive. Landowners apply. If they meet the requirements and are in priority areas for conservation, they can receive funding to retire that acreage, and then trees and wetlands are built in its place. And in most cases, those easements are perpetual, and the farmer ends up having a nice forest and wetland on their property that they can recreate in or sell if they choose, or lease for recreational uses if they want. And then they don't have the same environmental impacts that they would if they were trying to farm it and it was flooding every year. That program has been so successful. Approximately 700, and it's probably closer now to 800,000 or 900,000 acres have been enrolled in this wetland easement program since the mid-90s. So it's added almost 1 million acres of bottomland hardwood forest and wetlands to a region that desperately needed it since the mid-90s. And it's a win-win for landowners. It's a win-win for the government. It provides habitat for migrating waterfowl. It provides an economic opportunity for leasing to duck hunters, when in between crop seasons. So it's something the Nature Conservancy has been involved with for a long time, and we work very closely with USDA and the landowners to ensure that the right properties are being enrolled for the most benefit. But it's significantly oversubscribed, meaning that every year USDA has to turn down 9 applications for every application they fund. So it's a extremely supportive program from a landowner perspective, and it's one that's doing a lot of good on the landscape.
What's needed to accept more of those applications? Just funding, probably from Congress?
Yeah, that's a great question. Funding's always better, right? If you
right.
if the Farm Bill is been described as the greatest private land conservation tool in the United States, and I think that's true. It's roughly a $60 billion a year program, and approximately $5 billion of that is spent on conservation. Yet we do some of the most important work in the U.S. through that program. The wetland easement program that I just described, it's funded at a $500 million a year national budget and could easily spend twice that. Is that possible in Congress to just double a program? Not likely. We're going to continue to work incrementally to increase funding where we can. I think another opportunity is to just increase the sources of capital and financing available for those kinds of projects that are not necessarily government funded. There's a lot of companies. There's a lot of interest right now in reforestation and mitigating for climate change. There's a number of markets like carbon and wetland mitigation and nutrient credits that could be used to finance some of this conservation from private entities that have an interest in doing that. We certainly know, as I've described, that there's a large base of landowners that are interested in this type of conservation, but outside of their participation in government programs, there's not enough funding to get those lands enrolled. So I think we've got some opportunities to increase the conservation finance in the Delta that's in addition to the Farm Bill.
Yeah, very interesting. Those flood prone and less productive croplands, this kind of conversion is basically the best thing to do, or really the only thing to do, the only solution in those situations?
I personally think it's the best solution. If it's your farm, you may not consider it the best solution, to be fair. A lot of this land has historically been protected by levees that worked very well for a number of years, but weren't necessarily designed to exist without maintenance. They weren't necessarily designed to prevent the frequency of the flooding that we're experiencing. So it's a very expensive option, particularly when we have a global need for increased reforestation. The dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. If we can, if we can repurpose some of this land that's not working commercially for agriculture and put that into a condition that improves our fishery in the Gulf of Mexico, reduces carbon, provides waterfowl the additional habitat, then we can use the revenues generated from those other economies to not only make the people whole from a financial perspective, but the planet in a better situation as well.
I know that the floodplains is a big deal along the Mississippi River, right? There's whether it's urban or cities and towns that have been developed in floodplains, or farms that have been developed in floodplains. What's just the overall approach, especially through that lower Mississippi area, the Delta, on protecting or restoring natural floodplains?
I think the overarching approach is collaboration. This is really it's really in the interests of many stakeholders. So finding those partnerships and aligning where maybe a conservation mission and an agricultural mission can find common ground. That's really the approach. I think I heartedly believe it's in the best interest of all of us to make the right decisions on this land, and our approach has always been collaboration. Even if that means creating policy, changes, we're often doing that in collaboration with agriculture partners, cities and towns, counties, federal governments. It takes a true partnership to really find those win-wins, and I think that's the approach that the Nature Conservancy is trying to facilitate.
Sure. I want to ask you about a couple places here. We talked about this one also, the White River Refuge. So if you look at that Google Earth or the satellite view on Google Maps, you have that big tan carved out area, but then you have this very big noticeable strip of green. What's the White River Refuge, and what's the role of that?
Yeah, the White River Refuge is just a fantastic place. It's it was really, maybe controversial at the time to some, but visionary in its protection as in the 1930s. Actually, it was if I'm not mistaken, I may have my facts slightly wrong. It might have been the first national wildlife refuge in Arkansas, and it's about 165,000 acres now. It's anywhere from 1 to 5 miles wide, 90 miles of the lower White River. And it was protected by the U.S. government, like I say, before it ever had the opportunity to be developed. And it's really the foundational piece of where we build off our other conservation, estate, to have that block of woods that runs essentially 100 miles upstream from the Mississippi along the White River, really has given us the foothold in conservation that we can build off of, and that's what it's done. In the mid '80s, the Cache River National Wildlife Refuge was created, which is main tributary to the White in the Delta, and now that conservation estate is over 70,000 acres. So we've gone up another 100 miles up the main tributary of the White, and many of the easements that I talked about in the USDA program are built, in the floodplains of those two major streams. So it really has, added value to and expanded the impact over time.
Yeah. Well, I was going to also ask you about the lower Cache River, because I think that's a success story. So is that what's happened there? Is that's been kind of protected?
Yeah, that's right. And the Cache was, is also slightly controversial. Anytime you've got agricultural interests, challenged by conservation interests, there's potential for controversy, and the Cache River is not an exception. Back in the 70s, it was slated for channelization to facilitate drainage for agricultural land, and it rallied a lot of conservation support, and eventually defunded the channelization project after 7 miles were completed, and that was really the catalyzing event that initiated the Cache River National Wildlife Refuge, which, again, as I said, sort of drains right into White River National Wildlife Refuge. So it's started. Nature Conservancy and a lot of other game and fish partners were involved, but through a series of land deals and federal programs, that refuge is now 70,000 acres, and really it was a wake-up call, I think, among conservationists that, hey, we know this place is special, but if we don't take deliberate efforts to protect it, it could all be gone. And that's been the rallying cry for a lot of conservationists. And it's a beautiful river. I mean, Cache River and its tributaries is where Cornell University and a lot of scientists were on an active search for the ivory-billed woodpecker about 10 years ago. Maybe it was even longer than 15 years ago. So ancient, large stands of bottomland hardwood forests still remaining along the river bottom. So it's a beautiful place.
Sounds awesome. Last thing I wanted to ask you about was unpaved roads. You have a lot of these areas, and you've got networks of unpaved roads out there, and that can lead to sediment and other runoff issues. But I think there's a little bit of a success story there that I was hoping you could share.
Yeah. I have some colleagues that I work with that might be able to tell it more succinctly than I can, but it was essentially identified that unpaved roads, which there's hundreds of thousands of miles of in Arkansas, which is mostly a rural state. Unpaved roads were a significant source of sediment into rivers. Not surprisingly, we get like 52 inches of rain a year. And so if that's hitting a gravel dirt road, that water is going to drain downhill into a stream. And it takes a lot of that gravel and dirt with it. Of course, these small headwater streams often they can fill up with sediment, reduce habitat for biodiversity. So we identified gravel roads as being a significant objective. We work with the county county judges, which is the administrative leader of a county in Arkansas, whose responsibility is to maintain these roads, which are often impacted by this rainfall. They have to spend county appropriated dollars, state dollars, to repair these roads. And we just saw it as another example of a win-win, where if conservation could come in and help work with these counties to design these roads to erode less, not only would it reduce the amount of sediment getting into the area streams, but it would be less expensive for the counties to maintain. And if they just didn't have to go back and fix potholes and eroding roads, they were going to save money. So we worked with some funding provided to us by some industry partners and the state of Arkansas, and developed some demonstration projects. Brought in the Arkansas Natural Resources Commission, which is the Department of Arkansas Agriculture, and eventually drafted a bill that provided state funding, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, to be distributed to the counties in a competitive grant process to do these road best management practices that will, again, make the roads safer and less costly to maintain, but at the same time keep sediment out of our area rivers. So yeah, it's a great story.
That definitely is. That's a great infusion of resources there too that went into the road maintenance. Good stuff. Well, Jason, like I said earlier on, I'm really looking forward personally to myself to getting out to Arkansas and exploring some of these places. And it sounds like the White River Refuge should be toward the top of the list, and checking out the water there. But thank you for sharing all this information and perspective. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Travis, and I expect you to give me a call when you get in town, and we'll check it out together.
No doubt. All right, Jason, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Waterloop.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to today's episode. A special thanks to Waterloop supporters Spring Point Partners and the Walton Family Foundation. The Waterloop podcast is sponsored by High Sierra Showerheads, the smart, stylish way to save energy, water, and money while enjoying a powerful shower. Save 20% with promo code WATERLOOP at highsierrashowerheads.com. Waterloop is also sponsored by Flume, the smart water monitor that tracks your home's water use in real time and provides data on your smartphone. Save 10% with promo code WATERLOOP at flumewater.com. If you like Waterloop, please subscribe to the YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on social media and visit waterloop.org to sign up for updates.
Waterloop, Waterloop, Waterloop.